So again, welcome to everyone. For those of you who are not familiar with the Atlantic Treaty Association, almost all NATO countries and many partner countries have national bodies or chapters of the ATA, the Atlantic Treaty Association. There are many different models, but they all share the basic aims of helping to promote NATO's values and the value of NATO within their own countries. And I'm representing the Atlantic Treaty Association of the United Kingdom today. And we've organized this webinar for obvious reasons at quite short notice. I'm delighted to welcome members of the ATA community and indeed from far beyond who signed up for this meeting. The purpose of today's webinar is, well, let me say what it's not. It's not to learn lessons from recent events in Afghanistan and the international community's engagement there over the past 2 decades. Vitally important that that work is done, and there will be plenty of lessons to learn for everyone. But the more pressing question that we're addressing today is how the international community can engage with the new Taliban regime, which is currently in control of almost the entire territory of Afghanistan. It's 20 years since the previous Taliban regime last held sway in Afghanistan. How will Taliban 2.0 differ from Taliban 1.0? And how will it attempt to deal with profoundly different Afghan society and demographics from the situation of 20 years ago, particularly in urban areas? I'm not going to rehearse all the questions which you have seen in our blurb on the website. What I'm going to do is switch as soon as possible to our outstanding panel. All our panelists, and you've read their biographies on the website, so I won't do formal introductions, so we'll leave those up there. But our panelists have all been involved within organizations that have been directly involved in developing and implementing policies relating to Afghanistan. They have a wealth of practical experience, and they're also highly accomplished policy analysts and commentators. Not only have you seen their bios, but those of you who've signed in and are part of the NATO-related community, you will know them anyway. Stanislava, Mladenova, Jack Segal, Jamie Shea, Jim Townsend. You'll also see some other characters on your screens, my colleague Riaz Ravat from the Atlantic Treaty Association of the UK, who, if anything goes wrong on the technical side, has agreed to take the blame. And then friends and former colleagues, Sir Hugh Bailey, former president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, Baroness Kingsmill, member of the delegation from the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. We have invited all the members of Parliament, current and former, who've signed up to appear, and we will invite them to comment or pose the first questions when we open up to everyone. So that's far more than you need from me. My name is David Hobbs, and I'll be moderating today. And so I'd like to kick off. Our first question, first area for discussion is, of course, the one that's exercising everybody's mind. Taliban 2.0, how is that going to differ from Taliban 1.0? And also, although it's not stated there, how accurate is it to talk about the Taliban? How monolithic is it? We tend to think of it in those terms, but there's the Haqqani network. There are different characters ranging from scholars to what have been described as bumpkins with machine guns. I'd like to kick off by asking Jack Segal, who has lots of hands-on experience, very much so, in country and also with Joint Forces Command Brunson, where he was 10 years a POLAD, political advisor. Jack, could you kick us off there? What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, David. I'd be delighted to. I'm reminded of a letter that I got from my father when I was a young infantry officer in Vietnam. He sent me a question It was letters in those days, remember? And he said, "Are you making any progress there?" Question mark. And when I traveled around Afghanistan with a 4-star commander, Sir Jack Deverell at one time, 2 German generals, from the period from 2002 to 2010, I was a civilian, so the military would tend to ignore me and focus on the 4-star. And I would quietly slip away and go to the mess hall. And I would sit down with lieutenants and sergeants, and I would say, "Are you making any progress here?" And the answer almost invariably that I would get is, "You tell me what I'm trying to do, and I'll tell you whether we're making progress." The challenge out in the countryside was enormous and very difficult for our young soldiers and officers to understand and to connect to. The village life was so far removed from anything they experienced in normal life. Even those combat veterans who had been in Iraq or other places, even Northern Ireland, that was so different from anything they had tried to accomplish. And so they were really thrust into a situation where they didn't have the tools, they didn't have the knowledge, they didn't have the background to understand the situation they had walked into in each of these small villages. I saw a tremendous effort by British, American, Canadian, Dutch, all sorts of troops to figure out what would work where they were serving. But there was the absence of that guidepost of a strategy. And Sherard Cooper Coles, in his book about his tour in Afghanistan as ambassador, he quotes Sun Tzu in the 5th century BC saying, "Tactics without strategy is simply the noise before defeat." So we went into it with that major obstacle in front of us. As you pointed out, David, the gap between the Taliban, as we see them giving press conferences in Kabul, and the Taliban that we met in the villages was extreme. The Taliban in the villages ran the social and political structure of the village to the extent that their power extended to where they could do that. In many villages, the Taliban were important and they were there, but they were not in charge. It was a warlord or a quasi-governor or a drug dealer. There were other power centers that had to be negotiated with. Now, who they didn't have to negotiate with was NATO and NATO forces, except when we flooded the zone. So, and we did that on occasion. Helmand province is certainly an outstanding example of that, but also Eastern Afghanistan. But the Taliban 1.0 were a bunch of uneducated young people who came and filled a vacuum. There was a power vacuum, there was a governance vacuum, and they filled it. That's not going to be an opportunity they're going to have as Taliban 2.0. And maybe I should stop there and not lecture. And let's come back and talk about what Taliban 2.0 might look like. Who's up next?
I have to remember to unmute. Our other 3 panelists, what are your thoughts? I'll start. Okay, Stanislava, what are your thoughts? What's Taliban 2 going to be like compared with Taliban 1? And how is it going to be constrained by the different form of society that is present, the different demographics which are present in Afghanistan now compared with during Taliban 1? You're muted. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning or this afternoon, wherever you happen to be. Just to add into this, and we had a great conversation prior to coming with all of you together today, so that absolutely, it is a, we can speak a lot about what went wrong and looking forward. Just to throw out some numbers for us, because, truth is in the numbers. Prior, in 2001, Afghanistan's population was just under 21 million. Today, it's just under 40 million. So you're literally dealing with a, if you can compare it to the baby boomer population, this huge influx of people and sort of growth in society. But you are literally looking at a very young generation that's sort of come in and heard stories and knows about what was occurring during their parents and their grandparents' generation, but may or may not have directly experienced all of that. So that's the first thing I want to remind us. The other thing is kind of a quick observation for what it's worth, because a picture is 1,000 words. When the first reporting started happening during the kind of huge reaction with all the media sources coming out, I observed some of the photographs that were coming up, guys on top of trucks with waving the flag, it's all now jubilant and victory. And what struck me is how healthy looking some of these young Taliban followers were. They were strong and they were healthy. They kind of, of course, they kind of had a spark in their eye with sort of their new victory. But that is very much in contrast to what I remember certainly during my days on the ground about reports of people in the rural areas who were, who the ALP, the Afghan local police, who for the first time when recruited had a bed, had a blanket, had a meal. So I think it's important for us to remember that there's definitely always been a disconnect between what we were dipping into as we sort of recruited from these groups and grew a 300,000 strong military, larger than a lot of NATO members, and kind of what we are dealing with today. To bring us back to the populist bit, we tend to think about, because a lot of the reaction has been, why DNSF, why it gave up, and the Taliban and so forth. And we tend to think about the population as a almost separate discussion from the ANSF and the stronghold of the security forces, forgetting that the security forces recruit from the populace. These are just like in our countries, you recruit from rural, you recruit from urban areas. So of course, when we've been hearing a lot about, why people gave up, why the willpower, forgetting that oftentimes these, the ANSF, just like any military, is a job. These people have they need professions. You can argue between people's ideological association and their need for survival to bring a paycheck home, and how that sways one way or the other. I'll leave that to the anthropologists and the social psychologists to decipher, and the economists. But I feel that we need to be really thinking about how, we think of, the Taliban is this one thing, the NSF is this other thing, the elite is another, the populace is another. And in fact, the complexity between these groups is so much more intermingled. And I think that's something that we've struggled with. And I'll leave it there and turn it over to the rest of the group.
Thanks, Stanislava. And I should have said a few words before asking you to speak. You obviously have fantastic expertise on dialogue between civil and military entities in conflict zones. And I know you spent time also in the office of the High Representative, civilian representative in Kabul, and all sorts. Well, it's all in your bio, but thanks very much. Jamie. I'll get it right this time. Actually, I don't really need to introduce you, other than saying if there is anybody who knows more about NATO, I haven't met them yet. So over to you.
Well, that's kind of David, but you certainly rival me in that category as Jim. But no, thanks. And obviously, like everybody else, like Stanislava, I'd like to start off by thanking you, David, thanking the HTA, Riyadh, and everybody for getting on the panel today. My sense with the Taliban, of course, is that it's too early to tell. Although hopefully, unlike a Chow and Lai, we won't need to wait 200 years. We could see a French Revolution, but we'll see pretty soon, particularly once today, tomorrow, they start announcing their government, and we'll see to what degree it includes non-Taliban figures, maybe former President Karzai, maybe Abdullah, maybe others. But my sense on this, David, is that we're going to have, as we've seen elsewhere, after insurgent groups have taken power, an obvious tension between the locals, the ones in Afghanistan throughout the years of struggle and resistance, last 20 years, who come out of villages, who come out of the very conservative rural areas, and the expatriates, those who have lived in more luxurious circumstances in hotels in Doha, Qatar, negotiating with the Qataris, with the international community, they're still there, or have been in Pakistan or even in Iran, who have had a lot more engagement with the international community, a lot more engagement with the modern world, and will be, as we've seen in Iraq, between the locals and the expatriates coming back to reclaim their power, a certain degree of tension for some time to come, and we'll have to wait and see who's going to win. I would predict personally that Afghanistan will trade towards an Iranian type of setup, where you have a supreme leader like Ayatollah Khamenei. In this case, it's likely to be Mullah Akhundzada, giving sort of religious and moral guidance. But then when it comes to the presidency, like in Iran, where we're flip-flopped between sort of conservatives close to the supreme leader, reformers like Rouhani in recent years are much more sort of, well, we have to govern the country, we have to get foreign aid, we have to do the deals to get the sanctions lifted, and we have to be more pragmatic. The other thing about Iran is that it shows that where you have a relatively educated population that's, if you like, knows the West, has had some kind of exposure to the West in the past, has been able to travel and so on, been to university, including women, it's difficult to put that population down. I mean, despite the strength of the theocracy in Iran, we see these periodic explosions of popular anger, living standards, about environmental pollution, about the COVID-19 in recent years. And we see after the Taliban re-entered Kabul on August the 15th, we did see popular outbursts of protest in some of the provincial cities. And as Stanislava has pointed out, and Jack as well, we're dealing with a different Afghanistan than 20 years ago, not only in terms of population, but of course, the number of people who are educated, who have joined the elite. And they will provide, I think, like the Iranian population has shown, some kind of resilience. So we'll wait and see how it happens. So we're dealing, of course, I think, with a different Taliban. I think we're dealing with a different Afghan population. Unfortunately, part of the evacuation, many of the Western educated elite that would run the central bank, that would run the airport, the universities, that will run the media, have fled. And I think one of the challenges that we have in the West is not just how do we engage the Taliban, David, but how do we engage all of these sort of this Afghan sort of government in exile, if you like, all of these educated elite people who are run the country, fled, but who are obviously going to be there as a kind of resource pool of talent expertise that one day, one thinks of the Baltic diaspora that went back to the Baltic states to pick up the reins of independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. How with that elite, how do we organize them so that they remain available to go back? Should an opportunity, a reformist opportunity, open up? My final remark for this round would be to say that obviously we're going to have to put the Taliban to the test. We're going to have to talk to them, because we can't put to the test if we refuse to have some kind of dialogue. But I think we're going to, and this is going to be the big challenge, we're going to have to make very clear to them what we expect from them. And this is not going to be easy, because there will be a team, and I belong to this myself, we all do, that would really want to put the bar very high. To talk to you, to recognize you, to deal with you. We want you to sort of, have women ministers. We want you, to sort of allow a space for political pluralism. We want you to organize elections and so on.
Maybe hold that thought, because we're moving into the next question. Let me bring Jim first, and then we'll come back to that, because we're going to talk about goals and priorities.
But on which they can act as well. Obviously the key thing there is, which nobody is going to dispute, is, avoid mass repression and don't, get into cahoots with Al Qaeda and ISIL again. But no doubt we'll come back to this as the discussion process.
Jamie, thank you very much indeed for that, because that really was extremely, I think it's an extremely useful idea to bring in the Iranian model, and Also, I detected more optimism there than we picked up from Jack a few minutes ago. So let me turn to Jim. Jim, thank you for participating. Again, somebody who needs no introduction. And I think for those of us who are familiar with NATO stuff over the years, Jim for many, many years was basically Mr. NATO in the Pentagon. And again, look at the bio, guys. But Jim, thank you very much indeed, both in, well, and also as president of the ATA. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Jamie Shea is always Mr. NATO in the Pentagon and outside as well. So I can only be a pretender to the throne, Jamie. So, but let me just throw a couple of things out and then we can move on to the next question. And one is that, you know, this, and Stanislava raised this too. There's a new generation of Afghan, a young one that's not, that wasn't part of that old, the old regime and life under the old regime. They're used to a different standard of living. And so for the Taliban, who surprised themselves when they found that they were so quickly to take Kabul and take the reins of government, I think they're going to have to try to figure out, so what should the life be like in Afghanistan? Because it's new to them too. But if they feel that they want to try to keep things the way they were, in terms of what they inherited, this society that built up over the past 20 years under Western tutelage and funded by the West, they're going to have to figure a way to fund and keep going the infrastructure, like the airport, the infrastructure, the schools, these kinds of things that they've now inherited and are not working. Whether it's the grid or it's sewage or it's water, it's, you know, they're going to have to take over and fund these things. And where will that funding come from? Their assets are frozen. World Bank tranches have been frozen. There's a they're gonna, so they're under some pressure today that they did not have back in the 90s when essentially they were running a country that was not modern at all. And the people had to were used to that, and the Taliban had an easier time of governance. Now it's going to be very tricky. And not only that, but the level of foreign participation that they're going to have to deal with is well above what they had to deal with back in the 90s. In other words, if they want to have international funding in the short term to continue and come back in, they have got to very quickly patch up relations with a lot of nations or institutions that have provided that funding. Right now, you know, the coffers are bare, except for what's probably in the basement of their finance ministry. And they've got to very quickly try to get the tap turned back on. And there are going to be strings attached to that from the international community. And those strings will involve having a society that's not what it was like back in the 90s. And they're going to have to figure that out. And finally, they're going to have to play a big time foreign policy game with their neighbors. The Taliban that it's taken over in terms of governance, in terms of control, is weak. You've got China that is not the China of the early 90s. You've got a China that's looking at a lot of potential for their own in their own interests in Beijing. I've heard that they're looking at Bagram and saying what a great place that would be if it was run by the Chinese and it became a big international port, if you will, an aviation port, as the Chinese want to exploit the rare earths and this type of thing going on in Afghanistan. And there's Belt and Road potential there for the Chinese that were not there back in the 90s. Russia's got an interest in that too. Russia has had we know the history between Russia and the Taliban and Afghanistan. They're going to have their eyes there. Jamie mentioned Iran as a model. Well, the Iranians as well are going to want to have a lot of influence, and so are the Turks, who want to get in there and get that airport going and begin to take care of Turkish interests that are there, and then Pakistan. The Pakistani relationship with the Taliban is different. It's not what you think it is. And there's going to be struggles within Afghanistan between the Taliban and ISIS. Al-Qaeda will be going in there. And so the Taliban is going to need some help dealing with ISIS. And is that going to be Pakistan? And what's going to be the Pakistan price? So I've just given some of the complexities, and just in terms of the Afghan foreign policy, if you will, and counterterrorism is huge. And you've got this group that's come in that's going to have to deal with all of those things that we've laid out. So this Taliban 2.0 has got a big job on its hands, dealing with an Afghan society that's not what it was and when they were last in power. And they're going to have to forge relationships with some of their former adversaries if they want to try to keep the infrastructure going in a Kabul that does not look like the Kabul of 1992.
Jim, thank you very much indeed. You've actually given us a great kickoff for each of the questions. And so you certainly saved me some hassle there, but that was brilliant. Thank you. And Jamie, I interrupted you, but now let's go back to where you got to on goals and priorities, because it's not obvious. I think we can all identify what we like in terms of goals and priorities and how we would like them to behave. But before we turn to how we might make them do it, what are realistic goals and priorities that we should try, if you like, to achieve with the Taliban in terms of, human rights? I won't feed it. Jamie.
Well, thanks, Dave. Very, very briefly, because everybody obviously has lots of things to say, and I'm learning a lot from the others. I think, first of all, we've got to get back in. The UK, the US, others have moved their Afghan embassies to Qatar, and obviously if we
Jamie,
reporting. Sorry?
Your bandwidth is causing us some problems here.
Oh, sorry. Well, I just...
we've got no problem losing visual, but when we lose audio, it's really annoying.
Okay. Sorry to use this expression again, but can you hear me?
No. It's not that great. I'm going to come back to you, Jamie, because it was much better earlier. Okay, let's priorities, goals and priorities. Stanislava, what should we be seeking to achieve in our dealings with the Taliban?
I think that I just want to pick up on one point that Jim mentioned about basically needing to run the country. And as we know that campaigning and popularity is different than governing. So the first thing I would hold them, I would find a mechanism with which to be held accountable to this is something that we've always had an issue with, which is capacity. These young people that we've spoken about, like someone needs to do these jobs within the ministries, no matter who it's run by. So you need educated people. If the Chinese are going to come and do business with Bagram or mining or take your pick, they want experts doing the job. And if they can't find them locally, they will bring their own, which completely puts out the window the whole notion of, growing and cooperation and kind of, prosperity for all. So that is my first point. The second point is on, what could be some of the objective. And I think this is where NATO, and we're not to go into the NATO role because I know that I understand it's a separate discussion, but through some of our engagement with global partners, Jordan, for example, and Egypt, these are countries that could really step up, or Morocco, step up and say, hey, guys, come here. Let us talk about how you can really interpret Islamic law. Because it doesn't have to be that way. There's multiple other ways. There's proof that it can actually be respectful of culture and tradition, but also taking into account modernity and the fact that the world has kind of moved on with all of that. I know with Jordan, there was, during certainly, maybe not exactly during my time, but certainly over the last couple of decades, where they came in and trained imams on how to, necessarily interpret and, preach about interpreting this kind of law. So that being one thing. Another thing is that this is a very interesting last point. Very interesting interpretation. I was looking at some of the reporting from a French journalist reporting on a group of, several Taliban leaders going into a local village and basically, serving justice. We know that they're very swift, very decisive, very contrast to what we know about what Giraud was known for. And this context, in this context, they basically brought a couple of young warriors, and basically it's like, you are under observation, you're under probation, you were shooting your weapon among a group of civilians. Did you not know that you're not supposed to do that with civilians because it scares them? Another man came in talking about basically it's like, you're on judgment because you spent too frivolously on your son's wedding. And the man basically saying that it's not my fault. He invited all these other people to the party and I had to foot the bill and deal with all of this. Basically, like, you know, you can in a very kind of strong, honorable way, it's like, you can judge me and give me any sentence you want if you find me guilty of this. Then to go on, the people kind of passing the sentence to go on and basically say, look, some of these farmers are so poor, they pawn their lands to pay for these lavish parties. And then they come to us, you know, kind of expecting us to take care of things. So of course you can open all of this for interpretation and you know make the argument one way or the other, and we're very certain about where they stand on human rights and other things, but we have to recognize that these are just systems that work. And one of the big lessons for all of us is that, you know, coming in, you know, guns blazing literally, and, you know, development blazing literally on all fronts, that, you know, everything that had been there doesn't work and it needs to be completely overridden and overruled. We have to find opportunities for working, utilizing things and you know, kind of not shutting down the dialogue for things that are so far removed from our countries and cultures. But remember that some things do work, and that's the reality. And systems of governance, you know, politics 101, don't always work in different ways and in different contexts. So I'll leave it there.
Stanislava, thank you very much. Baroness Kingsman, did I see you wanted to come in at this point?
Yes, I was very interested in what Jim had to say, because I, as a lawyer and economist, it seems to me that the funding is going to be the key point, and there is also a huge skills gap there. There's a lot of young people, as Stanislava pointed out, and they've been trained to use guns and to be warriors, but they haven't been trained to do much else. So it did. So, and also there's, you know, we've listed all those others that are going to be very interested: the Chinese, the Russians, the Pakistanis, even the Iranians, and also organized crime. You know, the opium lords and so on. So there's quite a lot of conflict there. And what I'm really interested to know is what our expert panel think is the possible role that NATO can play, that the NATO countries can play with these conflicting and competing interests that are around and about. What role is best for us? Is it education? Is it money? I mean, I'm sure that the deals that are going to have to be done, human rights versus charitable funding, you know, is one of those things that's going to become very significant, I imagine. And I don't imagine, but perhaps it's also going to be, you know, for how many people are going to get released out of the country in return for monies. I'm quite interested to know what we are going to do. You can see what other countries possibly going to be able to do, but what is the NATO alliance going to be able to do?
Let me step in here, because I realize that the questions that I laid out originally on the outline for the webinar actually are too interrelated to separate them out. And so let's open up, if you like, this whole thing. I know that Jim wants to come in, but I'm going to try and go back to Jamie to see if his bandwidth is there. But when we're talking about goals and priorities, of course, it's related to what levers we have, and that has already come up. And let's not forget, I'm totally sensitive to this notion, of course, that they're totally dependent economically on foreign assistance. But the problem is, or potential problem is, that Taliban 1 was extremely hostile, or made life extremely difficult, even to the aid community. You know, female UN staff members were supposed to be accompanied by a relative. The international community aid representatives were supposed to stay in one particular dormitory and therefore left. And when they were confronted with this idea of well, people will starve. It was then people will starve or something else will provide. They were remarkably resistant to this notion that people will suffer. And so do we hope that's changed? So again, what are our levers? I mean, great. It's surely it has to be different, and they have to be more sensitive to depriving their society than they used to be. And as Baroness Kingsmill pointed out, now what's the role for NATO? But not just NATO. As I see some of the questions coming up here, and I'll try and get to the questions later from the other participants. Who's the we? Is it the G7? Is it the partners, as Stanislava was pointing out? Key role, and we talk about cultural sensitivity, it's horses for courses there. Great thoughts. So let's open up all that. I'll go straight back to Jamie, then Jim, then Jack, and then we'll see where we are. Jamie.
Also, I really hope my sound's back on. Very frustrating to speak and not to be heard. Okay, I better go fast then before I get cut off. I'll try to answer the question from Baroness Kingsmill as well. I think as far as NATO is concerned, obviously we have to be realistic. NATO in military alliance, its military instruments is its fundamental one. It was in Afghanistan to train the forces of a government that no longer exists. It's now pulled those forces out. So we have to be realistic. NATO's leverage in a region where it's seen as being a loser, rightly or wrongly, but that's the way it's perceived, as having departed. Whereas Jim rightly says countries which are not particularly friendly to NATO, like Iran, Pakistan, obviously China, Russia, moving into the vacuum. So NATO has more limited cards. That doesn't mean to say no cards, Baroness. Play them carefully, but it has limited cards. It has to fall back on the instruments of others, as has rightly been said, economic instruments, the United Nations Forum, financial instruments, counterterrorism, diplomacy, and so on. But I think there is a model there, Baroness, which is China. If you've been, obviously, from the vantage point in the Parliamentary Assembly, looking at NATO's debate on China, where there's corruption, but there's also competition, there's rivalry, there's a technology aspect, and so on. You will have seen that NATO has aligned what it says on China very closely to what the G8 was saying, G7, excuse me, was saying on China in Cornwall, what the EU was saying on China, and the US-EU dialogue was saying. So I think on Afghanistan, it's going to be the Chinese model that NATO will have to align itself with the kind of diplomatic initiatives that will come from the international community more generally, and back with its own particular weight. That said, I think also, to be perfectly frank, my own view, part of what NATO will do will be self-protect. It will be not so much looking at what can we do in Afghanistan now, but how can we prevent the fallout from what's happened in Kabul from affecting us further. So counter-terrorism, which has been fairly low profile on NATO's agenda in recent years, will all go up the agenda. If there would be more attacks coming out of Afghanistan, which we haven't seen for 20 years, NATO will have to set up some kind of an intelligence sharing body between Europe and the US to monitor that very, very carefully. The second thing will be migrants. We've seen NATO engage in the Aegean, Mediterranean, alongside the EU to deal with illegal migration. Should there be millions of Afghans potentially wishing to flee Afghanistan, and 250,000 Afghans have settled in the EU over the last 3 years before the Taliban gained power, then clearly you could see NATO forces, as you see at the moment, dealing with the illegal migrants coming through Belarus into Poland, into Lithuania. You could see NATO playing a role in resilience in that particular area as well. I think that's quite possible. I think thirdly, NATO has invested a lot in training in Afghanistan. We all know that, resolute submarine mission. And NATO has trumpeted, the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, right in my view, has trumpeted one of NATO's big future tasks as being a trainer, in Jordan, in Ukraine, in Georgia, of course, in Iraq, where NATO, under the Italian command, is now expanding its mission in Iraq. And so I think one of the urgent things for NATO, I know, David, you didn't want to talk about lessons learned, but one of the urgent things for NATO is, oh my God, what went wrong in Afghanistan that we need to fix when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to Georgia, when it comes to Iraq and others, because we can't, on the one hand, in NATO 2030, proclaim this new sort of capacity building training mission in NATO, and then be seen to be sort of discrediting or undermining that notion by what happened in Afghanistan. So how can we make sure that we don't make the same mistakes and we do a better job? Because the failure of the training in Afghanistan should not be a reason for not succeeding elsewhere, where frankly, in terms of providing security to Iraq, to Georgia, to Ukraine, it must succeed. So I think there will be a little bit of a sort of self-defense mechanism in NATO initially. Everybody will want to be reassured that collective defense, the solidity of the US commitment to Europe, has not suffered because of some of the transatlantic disagreements, let's be frank, that have existed over the endgame in Kabul. But one of the things that NATO can do is, and I'll finish on this, David, is stress very, very clearly to the Taliban that allow, and you mentioned this, David, yourself, a very significant humanitarian and monitoring presence inside the country, because the Taliban are not only inheriting an economic crisis, Jim, they are inheriting one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world in terms of drought, in terms of migration, in terms of hunger, in terms of water scarcity. This is as bad as Yemen. And this is to be even more urgent, to my mind, for the Taliban than finding jobs for the Afghans in cities like Kabul and elsewhere. So to allow the UN unfettered access into the country.
Jamie, thanks very much indeed. Jim.
I agree with a lot of what Jamie said, but I'm going to be a bit more blunt, I think, or direct on it. I think, to answer the question about a NATO role, I think, and Jamie laid out some of the potential NATO roles, but I just don't think we're going to have a lot of NATO action certainly in the short term or medium term. There's not going to be a lot of NATO action in that region or with Afghanistan, even on the humanitarian basis. I mean, we know we've had quite the scrap with France and other nations who don't see NATO having a humanitarian role to play anyway. This is something for the EU to do. This is something for nations to do. And so I just think the politics at the NAC table will be riddled with problems that various nations will have to continuing some kind of NATO role in Afghanistan, whether it's humanitarian. I think you're going to hear from the Central Europeans, the Poles, the Balts, Romania, Bulgaria. They're going to say, look, we didn't like out of area operations anyway. We took our eye off the ball, and the ball is Russia. It's deterring Russia. It's getting worse with Russia. It's time for NATO to come home. It's all about deterrence, and we've got to focus there. And if we around the NAC table are going to talk about a humanitarian mission or something like that, even training in Afghanistan, they're going to say no. It's a slippery slope. It's the camel's nose under the tent. It's going to get us back involved there. We know what happened when we followed the United States in there. We're not going to do it this time. Our focus is going to have to be Russia. That's what you'll hear from them. And I think you're going to hear also from some of the older allies. They're going to say, look, this really reinforces the point that the EU, and we're already hearing this from Borrell, but the EU is really going to have to get serious about having its own military capability, so that if we wanted to stay at the airport in Kabul and we wanted to extend the rescue operation, even without the United States being there, that we'd be able to do it. And of course, Kabul, like the Balkans in the 90s, showed that Europe did not have either the political will or actually the capacity to pull off something like that. And so I think you're going to start hearing around the NAC table some of the things that we heard in after San Malo, where France and others are saying we have got to do more and be serious and credible about building a European military capability and a stronger European pillar at NATO, and that'll be that focus. And then finally, I think you're gonna, if you're the section, I think the first order of business is going to be NATO unity. NATO deterrence in Europe, NATO credibility depends on being able to project publicly that we are united as an alliance. Right now, there's a lot of nations looking askance at the United States, as they should. They're looking askance at our competency in terms of pulling off that evacuation. They're beginning to second guess themselves for not raising their hand and opposing what the United States was suggesting over the past 20 years here and there. I mean, there's a lot of introspection going on about the United States, and U.S. leadership has been hurt, frankly. And so if the U.S. were to roll in to the NAC next week and say, we think we'd like to get NATO to sponsor a humanitarian effort, and the U.S. is going to be there for, not that nations would say, sorry, U.S., you've had your shot. But certainly the ambassadors will go back to their missions and sit down with their staff and go, well, what do you think about this? It won't be as quick to follow the U.S. lead as it's been in the past. And so how long will this last? I don't know. But these are some of the politics around the NAC table, depending on who you are. Think about Turkey. Turkey's got a big game going on now with Afghanistan. That's their priority. It's not doing a NATO humanitarian thing. If the Turks are going to do humanitarian, they're going to do it. They're going to get credit because they've got big interest in Afghanistan. So I think, just to finish up, I think that in terms of NATO taking on any kind of operation out of area, whether it's Afghanistan or anywhere else, I think it is a different world. It's a NATO 3.0 when it comes to this kind of thing. And I think the politics are just tough. We'll have to see what happens in the coming months.
We are definitely going to have another webinar on the lessons learned and all that sort of stuff. Jim, thank you very much indeed. Jack, let's go back to leverage, because we've done very much the NATO aspect of that. But again, what can we hope for in terms of goals and priorities with the Taliban regime? What levers can we pull? And if it's not NATO, who's the we? UN's come up. Any other options?
Very good. Well, the European Union has always been there. I think Mr. Vendrell was there forever.
Yes.
The question is, what did they actually do? But I always, it always bothered me that the United Nations was never seriously part of the plan, part of if there was a strategy. The United Nations had a lot of capabilities in Afghanistan, still has a lot of capabilities in Afghanistan. And what they don't have is a lot of money. We just to kind of get it straight in our mind, this battle for control of Afghanistan is far from over. We have the Northern Alliance types. We have Ahmed Massoud. We have lots of people who are on the sidelines right now. Former warlords who seem to live forever, who are hiding or have backed away and have conceded to the Taliban in a way. But have they turned over their forces? Have they given up their weapons? Have they also stolen vast quantities of NATO weapons from wherever they're located? There could be, before we get to a Taliban 2.0, we may have a civil war 2.0. And we have to address that and recognize that. And the one thing that I think the Taliban leadership now in Kabul want is, as the Baroness mentioned, an economic rescue plan, an economic lifeboat, if you will. And they also have a humanitarian crisis and a starvation prospect ahead of them. They are really in very bad shape, and therefore they might be willing to listen to, as Jim proposed, the ambassadors as they return to their embassies. If we are going to try, though, if countries are going to try to attach a list of demands to recognition, they'll be ignored, I think, by this Taliban government. They don't want to hear about our demands when they've just won the war. They want to hear what we're going to do for them to help the Afghan people. And that should be our focus. This idea, and anybody who talks about training, I could give a lecture on how inappropriate the training was for illiterate Afghans, which is what we were aiming at. Just one specific example. They had Russian Jeeps when we arrived in 2002, which you could learn to fix if you had a mechanic standing next to you and a toolbox, and he would start by saying, "This is a wrench." Okay? And then we give them Humvees, which they have 4 computer terminals that you plug into, and the Army says, the US Army says, you need a 12th grade education to fix it. Well, I'm sorry, the only people who had a 12th grade education were ministers, not mechanics. So guess what? There's tens of thousands of rotting equipment lying around the countryside. Be a great business for somebody. I think we're a bit ahead of ourselves to say this conflict has resolved, that it's finished. Far from it. The people have gone down. They have hidden themselves. The people we didn't get out are literally hiding, but most people are laying low and testing the waters. And I see in Kabul in the last couple of days, some women are wearing burqas again. Some women are just wearing the Pakistani headscarf. They're seeing what they can get away with. And I think the Taliban are figuring that out too. But I just heard in Baldak, near the border, one of the first places that fell to the Taliban, that they have now enforced burqas, and they have been looking for people and even conducting executions. So there's lots of things going on that nobody is in control of, including the leadership who have taken over in Kabul. I think we've got a long way to go before we can make progress, but I think we can gain a lot of support from the current leadership by focusing on the humanitarian problem that they have right now.
Thanks very much. Stanislava, you want to come in here?
Sure. I just want to grow on what Jack just mentioned about your point on how, the UN was never a big part of the plan in all of this. I think the we in the last 20 years, of course, is very different than the we, because we're talking about multilateral organizations, but let's not forget we had bilateral agreements right alongside. Every time a country contributed to a trust fund for one thing, it was also doing something else on the side. With that being said, I think the poster child for that's imprinted in our minds is something with a very heavy military presence. No matter what multilateral mechanism you had on the ground, no matter what bilateral economic growth plan or programming you wanted to do, the sheer fact that you had at one point 130,000 military on the ground training another couple of 100,000 just became overwhelming. I think you could probably even, not to come up with new terms, but probably a sort of the civilian part was always going to be suffocated by the security element, because this was our main job. So I think you could probably argue and say that, now that we're going to a normal footprint against all of this, considering conditions and considering things open up, we can start having these conversations. Another thing, and this might be, a crazy idea, but you have militaries that actually carry out some of this work. In Brazil, for example, you have a whole humanitarian component, where they actually deal with providing basic service to the population. You have a conscription. It's a very different model. But I think that we really need to be open to, what's there to work with. To, of course, consider that, crazy things may be possible, magic things may be possible. This morning I was reading the New York Times, I'm sure you all picked it up, on the chairman talking about, working with the Taliban through some of these things. It's not excluded, crazy things happen during these times. So I think there is opportunity in chaos, but we also have to think about, if we had not had this giant footprint of, billions of dollars surpassing the Marshall Plan, everything else we talked about, what would this have looked like in its sort of genesis as a normal development relationship with a country that clearly could use the help and clearly would qualify for aid no matter what. So I think we are, of course, we all want to guess. It's human nature. We want an oracle to tell us the future, but we may have to just wait and see now that for a super long time, but what happens over the next weeks and months.
Thanks very much indeed, Stanislava. One of the things I'm learning from doing these webinars is that I am really bad at multitasking and trying to keep track of all the excellent comments that are coming in also on the live stream. Let's switch now to some of the questions that Jim in particular alluded to earlier. Let's switch to relations with the neighbours. We've seen this turn up increasingly, the relations with the Central Asian republics. We've seen some rather what I would describe as unfortunate remarks by the Prime Minister of Pakistan. What role can we expect the neighbours to play? What should we be doing with the neighbours, particularly the Central Asian republics and Pakistan? And we'll get on to China and Russia later. Who would like to start? Hey, Stanislava, quick on the draw.
I find one not to take away from everyone else. This is actually one of the issues I worked on. The neighbor. So as everyone would agree, every neighbor wants a stable neighbor. So that's at least a common objective that we all have. But I think that certainly during the Istanbul process, which I'm sure everyone remembers, there was a great deal of cooperation between, you had immediate neighbors, and of course you had kind of, the greater region, and things that we've already discussed. But during the Istanbul process, you had some very interesting cooperation activities around softer, kind of soft types of issues: disaster response, economic cooperation, social cohesion. These were almost, I feel, low-hanging fruit where you could, really sort of come together as a group. And going forward, if you can't agree on the hard stuff, start off with the small stuff would be my suggestion, or pick up from where a framework actually worked very well. If you want to completely detach yourself from NATO, if this is too prickly, don't call it the Istanbul process. Go to Egypt and call it the Cairo process. Bring yourselves together. Or if you are going to do neighbors, call it the Astana process. However you want to. But I think that if we can continue, all of us with the same type of political will and imagination, because there certainly was no lack of imagination in all of this, and get ourselves emotionally detached from who gets the credit and who had the idea to begin with, and whether it's just rebranding of an old policy. It happens in our countries all the time. Republicans did it this way, Democrats did it. It's the same policy. We've just rebranded it. That's perfectly okay. And I think we can do that, and should allow ourselves to do that, really for the sake of having faith in the process and moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Jim, do you want to come back in here? Relations with neighbors?
Well, I'm not sure if I can add anything more, but more complexity to it. Particularly, so how do we deal with the neighbors? The Baroness talked about, NATO. Should NATO jump in there? And one way could be to deal with neighbors, because the neighbors are also the Gulf states too, by the way. Because the Gulf states are very interested in seeing what the Iranians are going to do. I mean, it's a ripple effect, not just around the immediate neighbors, but down to the Gulf too. There is a seismic shift, if you will, among the political relationships down there, with some of the Gulf nations saying, well, is this something the Iranians, is this going to be a new emphasis for Iran? Are they going to be, and will this strengthen Iran? Will this take away from what Iran might be doing in Syria or in Iraq? Is there, so it's got quite the ripple effect. And it does involve NATO too, because of Turkey. Turkey's going to be up to its neck in it, trying to figure out how it can protect its interests, how it can grow its interests. So that's going to bring NATO into it too, at least politically. In terms of what NATO, what Turkish interests might be around the NATO table, should NATO be talking about the region, the Turks are going to have a very specific view on that, trying to protect themselves. But for the United States, here in Washington, we're already talking about, so how should the U.S. deal, like with Pakistan? We were dealing quite a bit with Pakistan when we were trying to keep the Taliban at bay. Now the Taliban have taken over in Afghanistan, the Haqqani relationship with their people, the Taliban, that they helped set up. So what should the U.S. relationship with Pakistan be now? If we want to have any kind of leverage or influence in Afghanistan, the United States, is the route through Pakistan, or will U.S.-Pakistani relationships wither and get worse? I don't know. But for the United States, this is something that is going to be difficult for us to navigate. We've lost face in the region. We've been seen as being weak in the region. Why would any country want to league in with us, given what's happened here? So, and it'll be a liability for some nations. But I will say this too, in terms of the U.S. relationships with the neighbors, if we're going to be doing counterterrorism, and this is important for Europe and for NATO too, but if the U.S. is going to take on a counterterrorism mission to keep the Taliban, but particularly Al Qaeda in line, we're going to have to operate. Out of some neighbor country, and not necessarily, there's others that we haven't talked about yet where we could operate out of, whether it's for intel collection, whether it's for drones, that kind of thing. And that's going to be pretty hard to pull off too. So when you talk about relations with neighbors and dealing with Afghanistan for the United States, obviously we're working hard on that. We have a weak hand to play. And I think over time, we'll see what we have to pay to have access, and what nations are going to demand in return to bring on the discredited United States. But I think I'll just end by saying, when you think about Afghanistan, you think about the neighborhood, think broad, because it ripples down into Saudi Arabia. It ripples into Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. It ripples to many places you wouldn't necessarily think about, because this is a tectonic shift, and we'll have to see where it goes. And for the United States, it's going to be really complex.
Okay, Jack, and then Jamie, I see you as well. Jack, so.
Let me just pick up this idea of which countries are more likely to make progress. First of all, with regard to Russia, I find there'll be a lot of voices in Moscow saying, don't go there, don't go there. We've been there, it's bad. So I'm not really too worried about the Russians marching back in with the Red Army. But Turkey and Pakistan are interesting exceptions because they are Muslim countries. And I feel that one thing the Taliban are celebrating is the liberation of Afghanistan from the infidel army. And we have to kind of grasp that and say, okay, we don't agree with that. It's not really true, blah, blah, blah. But it's a selling point for them out in the villages, that you aren't going to see Western troops with guns marching into your village, knocking down your front door and looking for terrorists, quote unquote. We may have made more terrorists than we captured or killed by those night raids. And anybody who met with President Karzai, I know you, Bailey, you did, and David Dobbs, you did, that was the first thing he talked about were the night raids. He said, what you are doing with these night raids is violating the sanctity of the home, and you are taking away the honor of the male in charge of that home. And if you keep doing that, you are just going backwards. He hit it at every meeting that I went to, and that was 40 meetings. So he never gave up on that. Now he is seated next to the leader of the Taliban. The former president is meeting with the head of the Taliban in Kabul. So the message is going to get through. We want to do counterterrorism, I know, and we probably need to do counterterrorism, but it smacks of Western intervention in their daily lives, and they don't want it. So we have to adjust and accept that.
Yeah, thank you. Jamie.
Yeah, thanks, David. I've got a couple of observations to build on what's been said. I agree, first of all, with Jack that we're dealing here with the Taliban with a national, as they would see it, a national liberation from a foreign control and occupation, which means that they therefore do not want to replace what they see as Western or NATO occupation with Russian occupation or Iranian occupation or Pakistani occupation or anybody else. Now, in the short term, this has been said, we've lost leverage and we've lost influence, and we have to therefore play a longer game. This is going to take time. The Taliban realized from their experience between 1996 and 2001 that if they sort of associate with international terrorism, notwithstanding what happened, we are likely to come back in. Their regime can be vulnerable, even from other pressures, for example, from Russia. So they're not likely to make that mistake twice. They're not likely to sort of vote for their own suicides. So they're likely to avoid provoking the West or the United States in that sense, to keep themselves in power. So they're going to be around for a while. And we know that once sort of country is under authoritarian control, it can go on for several generations. We don't have many democratized countries where we no longer, unlike in Japan or Germany after World War II, have considerable forces on the ground. So we're going to have to be focused, and we're going to be realistic and modest. Our interests are two, as I've said: the terrorism piece, that's absolutely fundamental, and the humanitarian piece, which is an obligation of democracies and multilateral organizations. And we're going to have to focus on that. We're going to have to recognize that the others are going to have more influence. But what we've seen elsewhere in the world is that when countries, for example, like the Philippines, exchange Western American influence for Chinese influence, thinking that they're going to get a better deal, after a couple of years, they realize that that new deal is not so sweet in terms of the exploitation of their resources, in terms of the political pressures they come under. And you've seen Duterte, not necessarily my favorite character in the Philippines, now having tasted the Chinese model, gravitating back to the US model. And now I know that that's not feasible with the Taliban in the near time, but over a period of time, they could quite see a closer relationship with the West. Think of Vietnam today as being the sort of balance that they may need, and a preferable balance to the hot breath of far nastier neighbors like Russia or Pakistan or China on the back of their necks. So I don't rule that out. But I come back to the fundamental point: to have any kind of role, we need embassies back into Kabul. The EU is now coming up with the idea of a kind of joint embassy. Even see the UK, interestingly, notwithstanding Brexit, interested in the sort of sharing some kind of joint embassy space with France and other EU countries in Kabul. We need to get our diplomats back in, because unless we are on the inside, we're not going to be able to identify those opportunities and openings to engage and exert influence if we are purely on the outside. Finally, one final thought. We had into the transition of power in Doha a framework of countries, call them friends of Afghanistan, if you like, who were working with Qataris. The Turks, of course, were in the peace. The Russians were there too, but who hosted a kind of framework, just like the Peace Implementation Council for Bosnia, going years after date, or with the +1 negotiations with Iran on the nuclear file, where we work with the Russians and the Chinese on a common interest. You could quite consider trying to carry this work forward with Russia, with China, as we do on Korea. We don't necessarily get on with these countries, but we recognize a common interest in preventing Korean nuclear proliferation. These frameworks may be more effective one moment than others, but they don't disappear. And therefore, I would argue that maybe one thing that European diplomacy could try to do, this is maybe a topic for NATO, is to see to what degree we can keep such a framework going, at least to keep channels of communication open, because the Chinese have made it clear that they don't want the East Turkestan liberation movement being supported by which they see as undermining their positioning in Xinjiang. The Russians, of course, have put their troops back into Tajikistan and Uzbekistan because they fear the resurrection of the movements that are active in Central Asia. So there may be a entente with Russia and China, like we've seen on Iran, like we've seen on Korea, in a broader framework that we can use to at least keep some skin in the game.
I'm very conscious of the time, and I still have one, and we've already just opened it up. Let's spend some time talking about the Russian and Chinese agendas. Obviously, they're opening Russian champagne, and presumably the Chinese version as well, in their respective capitals at events. Their embassies are open and they're moving in. What are their agendas? And is it going to be as simple as they think, as has already been mentioned? And is there any convergence with the agendas, for example, that we might wish to implement through the UN, where presumably there are, and we all have humanitarian concerns? And how is that going to if you like, open up new areas of conflict with the West writ large. So Russia and China and Afghanistan. Who would like to pick up that hot potato? Jack, you're laughing too much. Unmute and come in.
Nobody's jumping for their microphone here. As I said, I think Russia is going to be extremely cautious, but they certainly are going to celebrate the defeat of NATO. And I hate to use that term, but that is certainly how they are characterizing it, and that's certainly how they are going to present it. China, I don't know. You know, I've been hearing about billions of dollars worth of natural resources buried under the wastelands of Afghanistan for 20 years now. And there was one attempt by the Chinese to dig into that, and it was not successful at all. I think they're going to wait. They're going to wait and say, okay, they're going to make some gesture that's humanitarian, but they are going to wait to see how dangerous is it. Because the Afghans weren't thrilled with having hundreds of Chinese workers in their country either. So I think the school's out on that. I think, yes, they'll have friendly relations with both of those countries, the Taliban government, but I don't see that as we don't need to go back to the Cold War on this. That's history. The Taliban don't need it either, so they're going to look forward and say, who can help us the most? Who's willing to help us the most? And there, the debates have yet to be held. You know, in my country, we tend not to agree on most things at the governmental level, so it's going to be a huge fight. You know, humanitarian aid for Afghanistan, it's going to be a very tough sell in the Congress right now.
Jim.
Just a couple things.
Go ahead,
The first point is that in terms of a NATO, going back to the question earlier about, so what's a NATO role here? What should NATO do? I think this is an area where NATO will have a role to play in Europe, dealing with Russian disinformation that is going out now to the Central Europeans, saying, so look at your great savior, the United States. They did a great job in Kabul. You think, how are they going to do in Tallinn? And of course, NATO is tagged in this, and I think the disinformation will include NATO as a paper tiger, or however the Russians are going to want to sow this doubt in the minds of not just the new allies, but older allies too. This is just as fodder for them to use in a very sophisticated way in their disinformation. And NATO needs to push back against that. And I will say, so does the Atlantic Treaty Association with its chapters and its reach into allied and partner countries. That's something that we're going to help NATO do. To counter this, and we got to be sophisticated about it. It's not going to be some videos coming out of NATO PDD. As much as I love them, I think we're going to have something that's going to really to deal with what the Russians are going to do, making hay from this. So that's one thing. I do think on China, and Jack, I agree. There's always talk about minerals hidden in all kinds of places. Greenland. I mean, there's always this hoard of gold somewhere, But I do think the Chinese are going to look for ways to particularly well, I don't think the Chinese liked this big U.S. NATO presence right there on their border. They didn't like that. The intel collection and all that comes with the U.S. NATO military presence was something they didn't like. And of course, I don't think we're going to be coming back anytime soon. I'm not sure how paranoid they are about us coming back, but I think they are going to want to jump into this vacuum while the rest of the international community is trying to figure out what they're going to do and what their own political, like Jack, as you said, what their own political market will bear in terms of a new relationship in Afghanistan. There's a vacuum there. And the Chinese love to fill vacuums. I think you're right. They will be cautious. But I think their experience now with Belt and Road and the fact that this is right there in their neighborhood, they're going to be in there playing. And I do think Bagram is very attractive. And I don't think the Taliban are going to be doing anything with Bagram anytime soon, but the Chinese might. And so I think they're going to be looking for opportunities. There's a yawning vacuum there for them as well. And of course, there's the Uyghur issue there too. And so that's something that's that's a rabbit hole I don't even want to go down, but that's another Chinese interest in terms of handling their own Muslim populations and how that impacts with relations with the Taliban. And then again with Russia, Russians abhor a vacuum as well, and I agree it's not going to be the Red Army going in there, but they've got Chechen problems, they've got other geopolitical issues that affect them in that neighborhood, so they're going to be playing a great power game there too. 2.0, trying to figure out how they can improve their geopolitical position in that broader neighborhood and what that will call for them doing. And they might be one of the first nations to recognize the Taliban. There's things they can do that's not going to cost them, but that the Taliban will appreciate. And the Taliban are going to need help, like right now. And it could very well be it's the Chinese and Russians that can be the quickest to offer that assistance, with the strings, of course, that come with it.
Jamie.
I agree entirely with what's been said, that China and Russia are happy about what's happened because of the so-called slap in the face to the West, the propaganda victory against the West, not because the Taliban are back in control of Kabul. I doubt that they are at all happy about that, because the Western presence did them a favor. I slightly disagree with Jim in the sense that I think the Chinese were quite happy to see NATO in Afghanistan, because we kept a sort of a lid on a very unstable situation for many years, which meant that strategically they didn't have to deal with it, particularly the Russians, of course, after their experience in Afghanistan up to 1989. Now that we've left, of course, a vacuum has been created in which everybody is rushing. The Iranians have to protect the Hazaras, who have been persecuted by the Taliban in the past, the Shiite Muslims. The Tajikistan and the Uzbekistan have to obviously deal with Tajik Uzbeks in the north. Pakistan feels a responsibility towards the Pashtuns. India is going to come back in. So I think generally for us, locally than a victory, but they will exploit it. You see already the way in which Putin has been exploiting the situation to regain Russian influence, reopen Russian bases, persuade Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and Central Asian states to accept a larger Russian military presence, joint exercises, and Russian troops on the border once again. So there is definitely a narrative being played out of pumping up in Russia the Afghan threat in order to reintegrate in security terms the Central Asian states and resurrect the Central Security Treaty Organization. One interesting question is to what degree Russia and China will cooperate on Afghanistan. They've got this thing going called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as you know, with the countries in the region, ostensibly being built around counterterrorism. And will that co-opt eventually the Taliban regime into that sort of regional framework, or will that regional framework, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, increasingly be built against Afghanistan, pointed at the possibility that the Taliban Russia, by the way, has designated the Taliban as a terrorist organization. If you read any Russian press agency report like TASS, every time it talks to the Taliban, it says in brackets, a terrorist organization outlawed in Russia. So there is, as for some Western countries, a problem with the recognition legally of the Taliban regime if we continue to see the Taliban, as Russia does, as a terrorist organization. So they're going to have to sort this among themselves. So yes, in the short term, they see advantages, but in the long term, they now own the problem, and they're going to have to, in humanitarian terms, where they haven't been as generous as the West in terms of humanitarian aid, in strategic terms, in CT terms, they're going to have to step up to the plate. And whether they manage to do so cooperatively with their own regional structures, or whether they do it in competition with each other, is something that's going to be interesting to see. In fact, if I were in the United States, Jim, I might even be experiencing a bit of schadenfreude about all of this, now that countries which have been content to sort of snipe at us from the sidelines and leave us the burden, have to try to fill that vacuum themselves. Will they do it more successfully? Only time will tell. But as I said earlier, final comment, in the long run, this may well present opportunities for the West, but unfortunately not for the next 10 years or so.
Jamie, thank you. Stanislava, last on this particular series. Want to come in?
Just very briefly about the mining thing. This is something that, you know, I remember when there was a presentation at NATO HQ back in 2011 about this whole issue. It was a big thing. You know, this is the answer: natural resources. Just to remind us back to basics. These maps have existed since, you know, the Russians knew about. Everyone's known about this for a very long time. You need infrastructure. You need roads. You need ability to extract. Most importantly, something that I saw during my time, you need good, strong legislation within the country and how to, when the stuff comes out of the ground, who gets their share at what cost and gets to use it for what. I remember looking at the royalties law. For those not familiar in the audience, it's basically, you know, what the country that has the resources gets to keep and what the country that's actually setting up all the stuff needed to get everything out of the ground gets to take. And these are very important issues that it's as I said, I think we've all been craving so much good news for this, but it can really very much go the wrong way. And this was the case with Aina Copper Mine. It took a couple of years, I think, for it just to go through Parliament. And as we know, even if a law exists in one way, written on the books, practicing it, operationalizing it in reality to benefit those whom it's supposed to benefit, not the elite, not the power brokers, but the people, it's a whole other story.
Stanislava, thank you. Let me now bring in our parliamentary or former parliamentary patrons, friends, colleagues. Let me start with Sir Hugh Bailey. Great to see you again, Hugh. Actually, he's just down the road from me, but we don't see each other that often, I'm afraid. Hugh, any comments, observations, rude remarks? Over to you.
Well, let me comment on these questions about humanitarian responses. A humanitarian crisis unfolding in Afghanistan. Almost half the population won't get enough food to feed themselves without outside assistance. I would say to all the panel, there's a humanitarian need, but it's not a need for NATO to fulfill, even though the military may, in some circumstances, provide support operations for humanitarian relief. This is not the country, and NATO is not the organization. As Jack and Jim have said, we are the losers. We are a tainted product, and we would hinder rather than help humanitarian operations if we were to be associated with them. In December 2001, I was in Peshawar. I saw Western-funded World Food Programme operations at scale with trucks which were defended with guns where necessary, but they weren't military guns. It was a civilian operation, and the humanitarian access was provided through negotiation, sometimes pretty crude negotiation, with those putting roadblocks up on the way. And if we want to deal with humanitarian questions, and I think we as the West should, because we want to show the world that we continue to care about Afghanistan, that we weren't just there to create a neo-colony for the West. We wanted to see the development, we wanted to see the benefits, which as Stanislava has talked about, of Afghanistan today compared with Afghanistan 20 years ago. It's a good thing for us to do, but let's do it through the World Food Programme, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and other agencies. I think there's a big question when we come to lessons learned about the integrated approach. We learned through this operation that you can't build a stable state through a military intervention alone. You need military civilian cooperation, and it hasn't worked well. In this particular area, I think it was Jim who said that we shouldn't write off state building as something we seek to do in every situation, but we certainly have a lot of lessons to learn about why so much was invested in this with so little to show at the end of it. And the final comment I wanted to make was about the economic situation. Although a lot of aid has gone into Afghanistan, the bulk of the Western money that has gone and fueled the economy has been military spending, military training, support for the Afghan National Security Forces. And although aid, to some extent, will continue, there'll be a very sharp drop-off of sort of Western public expenditure in Afghanistan, which will have an enormous impact on the economy. And the only way that Afghanistan can recover, it goes back to what you've been discussing as panelists just a few minutes ago, is if you can create conditions where commercial operations open, whether it's running airports or exploiting minerals. And again, I think, you know, I've listened to the experts on the panel, but we are starting, you know, Western companies are starting on the back foot because of the history of the last 20 years, and China will be very much on the front foot. So those are my sort of reflections. I just say to all the panelists, thank you for your insights. What Jack says about Karzai warning that bombing people into agreement that we are good partners to deal with terrorism created part of a problem that we see today. And that's certainly an issue to come back to on lessons learned. Thanks
very much indeed, Hugh. Baroness Kingsmill, can I ask you if you'd like to come in with any comments or questions?
Well, again, I come back to the fundamental point that probably there is nothing to be done in the short term, but there's going to come a point where there's going to be negotiations, and it'll go in a circle. Undoubtedly, there are people who are trying to get out, that we want to get out, and that the Taliban have stopped getting out. So that may form part of the negotiations. Certainly, all modern societies depend on economics, unless they're going to go right back to, you know, farming opium as their main export. You know, 90% of the opium in the West comes from Afghanistan still. Is that how it's going to be? Even more so, is that how it's going to be commercialized even more? They will have to build an economy sooner or later. And I'm rather with Jim. I think we're probably fairly low down in the queue as far as there is no rule of law there. There is no economic framework. I think Western companies are not going to want to invest in that country for a long time yet. But I think the neighbours that we've talked about, we've discussed, probably are quite happy to pile in there in the hope of getting some resource. But I think I feel fairly pessimistic in the short term, as that there's much that can be done for the time being. I think there's still a lot of pain to go through before we can get much further.
Thank you very much indeed. We're
not very optimistic, not a very upbeat message. But I think that's
on that happy note, yeah. Let's see if anybody's going to cheer us up with just a few final parting shots. Are there any issues that our speakers would like just to raise, think that we haven't covered? Any observations? Well, I'm going to do alphabetical by last name. So if I get that right, Stanislava.
I just want to take us something we've not talked about, and Jamie, you're the media guru on this, having been in your position for many years at NATO. Just a warning, caution for all of us going forward. I don't know if we're going into Q&A, but the coverage and information that's coming out of this consistently, as we've noted, and that's not conveyed the last couple of weeks for the last 20 years, but there's social media did not exist 20 years ago. A 24-hour news cycle did not exist 30 years ago. There's a great responsibility that I think we all individually carry as experts, but also absorbance of the information that's coming out. Of course, there will always be a tricky relationship with, between the media and the Taliban. I was very glad to see that, them taking a question from a female and sort of, we were all cheering on about it. So good reporting will be very important going forward. So we can work with facts in these discussions. Next time we come around, we're not abstractly speaking, but actually also following what's really going on realistically. And remember that in addition to the news media, because of social media, because of this young generation that are so attached to their phones, remember 50% of the population now, you could be sitting in your home and tweeting about a situation of someone coming to, arrest someone or beat someone or take your goods or do something positive, vice versa. And we need to be very sensitive to recognizing the difference between substance, what's really going on, and paying attention and being able to weed through all of that. And sometimes sound bites, which is more the reactive piece. And that's what happens back in capitals, and how the discussion and narrative sets the mood around all of this. There will be, years, as we're talking about Vietnam, 30 years from now, will be 40 years from now, we'll be talking about this. And I think because so much individual power has been given to each of us to produce information and interpret information, all of us will be responsible in what the narrative looks like several decades from now.
Stanislava, thank you very much. Jack.
I would just note there a very interesting comment in the chat box from Juan Antonio, who said that when Western towns in the frontier of the United States were settled, the final step that we knew it was successful was when the sheriff collected all the guns. That's it for me.
Look, and thank you for raising Juan Antonio, who's a great friend. So thank you. Jamie.
Well, very briefly, I want to build on Stanislava because she made the point that I also think in closing, which is that with the Taliban taking power, yet another country lapses from democracy, no matter how imperfect, but all democracies, of course, are imperfect, into authoritarianism. As the Biden administration develops its sort of democracy promotion agenda, which is at the heart of NATO and the EU, we need to think creatively and imaginatively what instruments we have to keep the democratic spirit alive, particularly in countries, and I mentioned Iran, where clearly the population isn't altogether happy to go back to living under authoritarian government. For example, nearly all of the journalists of Tolo TV, including Stanislava, the lady who interviewed the Taliban official, 2 days later, she fled. She was in Germany because she was threatened. So that honeymoon for female presenters didn't last very long. But we've got, the Afghan diaspora, we've got the democracy promotion agenda. It's not easy, but standing up for the human rights of people, making sure that, people who are arrested during the night are not forgotten, keeping the light on, keeping the focus on. We went through this with communism, David, with the OSCE process, remember, back in the 1970s. So my final shot is just to say that, that's what we've got, and we have to try to do it in the best way that we can.
Jamie, thank you. Jim, last word. Unmute.
Last word is this, and it is something optimistic, and that is we've talked about all the problems, and me particularly. I mean, we've gnashed our teeth and rent our garments and pulled our hair, and we've beat ourselves about and called ourselves defeated and weakened and all that kind of thing. And for the U.S., we find ourselves often in that position. But frankly, that's a short-term feeling. I mean, I remember the end of Vietnam as well, and many other occasions since then. And that's how we react. But for the UK and for the US and a lot of NATO allies, we learn from the experience. And frankly, if you look back on the past 20 years, what Stanislava was talking about in terms of the phones that they have, the kids have in their hands, and we talk about the progress of women, et cetera. That's what NATO and the West brought about there. We don't see an Afghanistan society the way we found it. We have helped to lift that society. The monies that went in there, the efforts that went in there, not just soldiers, but also the NGOs and countless others have built an Afghan to help the Afghans themselves build the semblance of a society where human rights were respected and the role of women, et cetera. There was a lot of good that came from that. So what the Taliban have now got their hands on is something that is many levels higher than what they left behind when they departed Kabul back after 9/11. So I think we can look back on some very good things that I think will stand the test of time, and give the Taliban at least the opportunity to carry on some very good things. We'll have to see where they go. But I don't think we should look back on the 20 years and say it's a wasteland and this type of thing. It hurts right now. It stings right now. We're beating ourselves right now. This will pass. And I think we're going to look back on actually some good things that have come from this. And that's the first point. The last and second point is this. You know, after Vietnam, we were doing the same thing. The United States was particularly. And if you look at if you look at Vietnam today and you look at the U.S.-Vietnam relationship, it's not, no one would have predicted that back in 1975 when the helicopters were leaving the embassy facilities there in Saigon. So we will survive this as well. This is not going to be a calamity such that 2 years from now we'll be doing this webinar and saying, "Oh my God, the tragedies that have come from that period." I don't think that's going to be the case. I think we're going to all survive this. We'll see where this goes. This is not the end of the United States, and then not the end of U.S. leadership. What the U.S. is able to do, I think, is learn from our mistakes. Although I'll caveat that by saying I'm not sure how much we learned from Vietnam. But that aside, I think right now, I think with the rending of the garments happening in Washington, I think we're going to take away quite a different story than we did in 1975. And I think we're all going to learn, how do we deal with these crises in the future? Because they will come. They will come. And I think we're going to be smarter as we try to deal with those crises than we were perhaps with the George W. Bush administration. Beanie.
Well, I think that was a rather optimistic note to end on, and a rightly optimistic note. The history of involvement in Afghanistan, the past 2 decades, I'm sure you're correct. The last 4 weeks does not negate the progress that has been made, with all its imperfections and pitfalls. It could be there's a society transformed. The history is still being written. Indeed, there are lessons to be learned. And of course, I hope that we can reconvene at some point and chew those over. But I notice, despite the fact that we've run over, we've sustained a remarkably high level of interest among all the participants, who I would like to thank for joining us. Particular thanks to the panelists, who have just been absolutely magnificent. A very nice remark from Sir Hugh on that, which I hope you've all managed to read, and I'm sure others as well. It has been an incredibly fulfilling 90 minutes, fascinating, self-critical, as Hugh pointed out. Thank you all very much indeed. I look forward to seeing you all the next time. And thank you particularly to the Parliament participants who joined us. Thanks very much. Let's go and have a cup of coffee. Thank you.